everybody to start identify yourselves while you're voting. Just a reminder. The same thing when you're nominating or seconding a motion.
Somebody's sending in a vote by Morse code.
Right?
As long as it has your name, Gary, you're fine.
There's Janetta.
I'm doing you on my phone. I have to have one of my children get my laptop. I'm sorry.
Okay, we're ready to go, guys.
All right, all set. Ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Nassau County Rent Guidelines Board. This evening's meeting will be the deliberation and voting. I'm going to go ahead and have council read an appropriate statement into the minutes. Go ahead, please, James.
Yes. In response to the governor's directive to take every effort to keep New Yorkers safe and mitigate the spread of COVID-19, and pursuant to Executive Order 202-1 and its updates, which allows for the suspension of the Open Public Meetings Law, the Nassau County Rent Guidelines Board will be conducting public hearings to determine the guideline rates of rent adjustments for housing accommodations within its jurisdiction, subject to the Emergency Tenant Protection Act of 1974, for leases commencing between October 1st, 2021 and September 30th, 2022 via Zoom video teleconference. Please note that all meetings will be live streamed via YouTube starting at the designated time of the meeting. Instructions for members of the public to simultaneously listen to the hearings are posted on DHCR's website for the Office of Rent Administration under the Public Hearings section. The hearings will also later be transcribed, and the public will have the ability to view the transcript. The YouTube live stream can be viewed on the Nassau County Rent Guidelines Board YouTube channel. All live meetings will be recorded and will remain on the YouTube channel for future viewing.
Thank you. Members of the Nassau County Rent Guidelines Board, please introduce yourselves.
Good evening, Janetta Alexander, public member.
Andy Cohen, owner's member.
Garrett Gray, public member. We've lost count.
Adam Mahoney, public member.
Martin Melkonian, public member.
Robert Ruwoski, tenant member.
Barry Stein, owner's member.
My name is Mike Miller, and I'm a public member. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go right into our deliberation. Anyone in particular wants to start? You may go ahead now.
I could start. I've got some comments.
Just before I apologize, have you had a chance to go over the minutes for the last meeting?
Yes, and kudos to James for turning that around so quickly.
Really, really quick. Thank you very much. Do I have a motion for acceptance?
Motion to accept.
Garrett, Catherine, did I see your hand? Yes, Catherine seconded. All in favor? Aye, and raise your hand.
Aye.
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 Thank
Barry
you.
Stein, aye.
Okay, all move forward. Okay, any other comments? Nope. All right, so we're open for deliberation. Who wants to go first?
I could go.
Go ahead, Andy. State your
Okay.
name and go ahead, please.
Okay. I'll try to get through it quickly, but it may take a little time. It's interesting that we had just 7 speakers over the last 3 meetings. And if you eliminate Mr. Paddock and Mr. Schneer's multiple testimonies, we had just 1 tenant, Mr. Schneer, out of 7,554 EPTA apartments, and 2 landlords out of 242 meetings. It's just a fact that I wanted to put out there. I wanted to follow up on my questions to DHCR regarding the number of buildings with EPTA partners. There was 334 on one schedule and only 242 mailed out. The difference is 92 buildings representing 2,957 EPTA apartments, or 39% of the total EPTA partners that are not included in the schedules. I just wonder what the result would be if those apartments were included. Reference is made to Mr. McKee's written testimony. I actually read it after the meeting because I just didn't get to it. I found that much of his written testimony was not correct in the areas of debt service, interest, and depreciation. I can explain further later if you'd like me to, but I don't want to spend the time now. Also, I found it very troubling with respect to ERAP that Mr. McKee indicates, without any evidence, we predict that many landlords will ignore this restriction and raise rents, unquote. I suppose it's a typical response from many, if not all, political action committees that give biased information and distort the facts. There was a discussion whether landlords obtain PPP payments, and the answer is no, as real estate is not eligible. They can, however, obtain EIDL grants that was limited to $1,000 per employee with a cap of $10,000. However, most buildings on average only have 0 to 2 or 3 employees, so that amount is really not significant. By contrast, a married couple with less than $150,000 in income would have received $6,400, and if they're single and the income was under $75,000, they would have received $3,200. In addition, if they had children under 17 years of age, they would have received, I think it was $600 for each child. Twice, I think it was for 2 of the 3 stimulus. The schedules indicate there was a 2% decrease in rents and a 0.2% decrease in rents and a 2% decrease in expenses. Just to quantify the 2% in dollars, based on the average cost per building, it would total just $1,086 decrease in expenses. That is not significant in my view. Also, I want to drill down on the 36% NOI. According to the DHCR report, this equates to an NOI in dollars of $30,874. If you reduce this by interest expense of $11,416, you get $19,458 in income on average, according to the reports, and that's before income taxes. So your starting point is $19,458. There probably is a deduction for depreciation, but there are income taxes. Therefore, based on this, I don't see the windfall, as the average building only has $85,000 in change in rental income. With respect to interest, those who have seen public company or private company financial statements, you'll always see interest as it reduces income. As I indicated in the past, the schedule includes regulated apartments as well as unregulated apartments. It still seems unfair to me that the result is that unregulated apartments subsidize regulated apartments. However, there doesn't seem to be anything in the legislative history or rationale to support that unregulated apartments should support regulated apartments. The rent stabilization law requires the board to consider prevailing and projected operating and maintenance costs. There was testimony from Mr. Paddock and Mr. Rush that real estate taxes, insurance, and oil, as well as other expenses, are increasing in the current year, and will currently experience an inflation rate of 5%. With respect to inflation, Mr. McKee forwarded a New York Times article by Paul Krugman that attempts to minimize the effects of inflation. Although Mr. Krugman hedges a bit at the end of the article, a review of Mr. Krugman's writings has been wrong in the past. Conversely, Lawrence Summers, former director of the National Economic Council for President Obama, has an opposing view on inflation, meaning that he thinks it's here and going up. So you got both sides of the story here. New York City passed guidelines last night with an interesting result. For 1-year leases, the first 6 months was 0, and the second 6 months had an increase of 1.5%, and 2-year leases were at 2.5%. As indicated in the landlord's testimony, the board should also consider for fairness and reasonableness an increase in 2-year leases. In addition, failure to pass an increase this year after the last 2 or 3 years with very low or no guidelines could have unintended consequences, certainly to maintenance of the buildings and the upkeep. Finally, we discussed every year the legislative findings of the EPTA Act of 1974 was to prevent speculative, unwarranted, and abnormal increases in rent, as well as to forestall profiteering and other disruptive practices. In my mind and my view, there doesn't seem to be any evidence that these practices exist today, nor was there any proof offered that this is happening. So those are my comments. I could answer any questions of anything I said, and if not, we can move on.
Thank you, Andy.
Can I respond on a couple of things? I believe Rob is going to speak mostly for the tenants, but one of the things that I'm acutely aware of is when we were talking about buildings that are supposed to be under the EPTA who may not be reporting. One of the biggest landlords in Hempstead, and I know this because I've been involved in lawsuits with it, actually is under the EPTA, but does not follow it whatsoever, and charges outside, it raises rents however he likes and does not. So that would be included, I would imagine, in the 98 that do not respond or that they do not follow up on because he hasn't responded in years. There are only certain towns that he responds in because he's been forced to. To do with profiteering and rent, well, I told you myself that my landlord raised my rent 6% in the middle of COVID. So, and he's for his non-rent regulated building, which I'm in. So I can at least attest to myself and for the people who are in his non-rent regulated buildings that there is that kind of profiteering going on. And as I said, my husband and I never skipped a rental payment throughout the entire time. And our rent that we pay is far more than what we saw in the rent, according to what HUD says. Another thing I would like to bring to the board's attention again is that because the idea that rent regulated units subsidize non-regulated units is not necessarily true. And I've known people and seen this before where preferred rents have been offered in the past, where non-regulated tenants, if the market doesn't bear what they're allowed to get under the rent guidelines board, they will offer a lesser rent. So that's not necessarily true either. And across the board, whether it be a New York Times article or Mr. Paddock's reference to Newsday, I don't think news articles hold very much value anyways in anything. And I know as a lawyer and the other lawyers on the board would agree with me, that would never be allowed in a court of law as being something that's considered to take note of. It's an interesting side commentary, but it's not, I would say it's not something that I would give much value to, whether it be tenant or landlord provided. So those are my comments.
If I could respond to some of that. With respect to this Hempstead landlord who doesn't follow the rules, we don't condone that, and somebody should do something.
It doesn't matter if you condone it or not, but what I'm talking about is when you were referring to the number of buildings that are under EPTA, right? And the number of responses they get, it's also up to the landlords to respond. And if it's a landlord that has not been responding for, let's say, 2 decades, they're not going to continue after that person, especially when they don't keep their buildings up to code and so forth. They're considered to be, I gather, outliers in that sense. So that was the point of that, Andy.
But we can't hold every landlord responsible and be punished because one landlord.
That's not what I'm suggesting, Andy. What I'm suggesting is it seems like, at least from my perspective, and correct me if I'm wrong, when you were talking about the number of surveys that were sent out or not sent out, it wasn't taking into consideration that we all know that this exists, and that if DHCR is not receiving information back from buildings that are technically under the, and I say technically because it's not enforced, under the EPTA, then they don't continue to send out to them if they don't respond.
Well, they're not
That was my
required
point.
to, they're not required to respond anymore. There was a law, a court case many years ago.
I know, fair enough, Andy. But what I'm saying is what you are representing. I'm giving another piece of information to that was left, that I feel was not included in your representation. That's all.
I was representing that almost 3,000 EPTA apartments were not included in the survey because they don't send out, they don't send the reports to them. That's what I was driving at.
Yeah, and what I was driving at is that after a number of years of the landlord not returning those, I believe that they do not send them out.
I think DHCR did a fairly thorough job going through the reasons. We may not agree 100%, but I really think it was covered extensively, in my opinion. The other board members can bear out their view, but I was quite comfortable. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Andy. Go ahead. Anyone else? Go ahead, Rob.
Okay, I'll speak. I'm just going to reference the statements of landlord and tenant testimony. Mr. Paddock offered a chart comparing rents in his properties in Rockville Center and Freeport to HUD fair market rents for similarly sized units, stated that his rents are below those of HUD. Mickey Chenier said, according to statistics collected from HCR in 2001, there were 11,940 ETPA units in Nassau County. By 2020, that number reduces to 7,508, a 39% reduction in the housing stock during that period. Many of these tenants are offered preferential rents, which are lower than the legally regulated rents. Upon examining HCR 2020 Office Rent Administration annual report, should be noted that out of a total of 910,767 registered rent regulated units statewide, 296,518 are classified as having preferential rents. That's nearly 1 out of every 3 rent stabilized units in the state. Then I'm going to go to a testimony from Richard Rush, but from last year. Obviously, the impact of COVID-19 cannot be ignored on both tenants and landlords alike. Landlords fully understand the difficult impact that it had on tenants in terms of health and financial challenges. Unfortunately for landlords too, things have been difficult. We face increased expenses in cleaning service and supplies to help keep our buildings safe for everyone. I'd also note that in his statement this year, that Richard Rush said that there were no increases in non-stabilized apartment rents. Then I'm going to go to Michael McKee's testimony. He said, well, 36% NOI is an indication of a healthy, even robust residential real estate market in Nassau County. Then he referenced in the spring, the state legislature appropriated $2.4 billion for the emergency rental assistance program. And on June 1st of this year, the New York State Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance began taking applications. IRAP will pay up to 12 months in back rent, and in some cases up to 15 months, as well as back utility payments for tenants who lost income due to COVID. These funds will be paid directly to the landlord. Now I'm going to read part of his summary. Question that you must address is, who is more able to survive the economic meltdown of the last year? The people who live in rent stabilized apartments or the people who own those apartments? For many reasons, it is clear that landlords are better positioned to come out reasonably whole. Burdening already hard-pressed renters this year with any rent increase at all would be harmful and should be off the table. You should freeze rents completely for both 1- and 2-year lease renewals, as you did last year. An important point also is many Nassau tenants were able to benefit from the current rent freeze, but other tenants have 2-year leases that do not come up for renewal until after September 30th. They will not benefit unless you freeze rent for a second year in a row. I think that the increase from last year in NOI makes it clear that we must have a 0% increase this year.
Something else I'd like to add to do with when you were talking about PPE money and so forth, and also the money that couples and so on received. It was not only to do with your income level, it also had to do if you qualified for it. So if you were an independent contractor, which there are a lot in New York City, whether it be working for the financial industry, whether it be working for technology industry, whether it be going through a staffing company, that sort of thing, you did not necessarily qualify for getting that money from the government. And so not every couple or every individual whose income was less than $75,000 or a couple less than 150,000 received that money. And I can say that because my husband and I were definitely
You're conflating PPP with the stimulus payment.
With the stimulus, sorry, I meant to say stimulus, but I can say that for myself too. With my husband and I, it didn't work that way because he works for himself. So
they changed that rule. They changed that rule where after a while they changed it where you could get PPP money.
But not from the original, and in his situation, not at all, and it didn't have to do with income.
But it was changed. And I was talking about stimulus payments.
It did not just do with the stimulus, it did not change with him. Even though they changed it so that certain independent contractors could, he could not.
I don't agree with that.
So it's not entirely true.
No disrespect.
Can I respond? It's Barry Stein. Can I respond?
Go ahead, Barry.
A couple of things. First of all, I represent a fair amount of landlords, and I don't know any landlord that took the PP. And I happen to know, and I agree with Andy, obviously, that PP for real estate, what we're talking about, I don't know anyone that took it. That's the first part. The second part, I just want to make sure that people understand that when you talk about a profit, it should be after the debt service. By the way, Michael McGee was wrong. Interest is not a capital expenditure. Let's understand that that's a fact. Fourth, or whatever it is, I just want to repeat, according to Steve Paddock, the taxes in Long Beach went up, 6.33% for a homestead, and a non-homestead, 12.26%. Heating oil is up 35%, according to the landlords. Rockville Center's tax increased 3.99%. Insurance has increased from 16 to 18%. This can all be verified. I just want to read it into the record. Okay, thank you.
And we also saw that the mortgage, the people that the landlords that did refinance in the document we received from DHCR this afternoon, that prior, I believe it was 3.45% the interest rate, and now it's down to 2.85%. So there's been a decrease in the interest rate, the median interest rate for people who refinanced, and that was 20. I don't remember if it was 25% or 25 buildings, but there you go.
25 buildings.
By the way,
thank you.
Same thing.
I won't get it. It's ridiculous. Okay. By the way, whether the interest rate is high, low, it's still an expense. It might be below the line, and a profit should be after it, not before. And just for the record, I just want to read this into the record. Cash flow pays the business, pays the bills, not net worth, just for the record.
I'd like to respond to Barry's comments about the tax increases. I think it should be noted that the biggest part of the tax bill is the school tax, and the school tax increase in Long Beach was 0 this year.
A tax increase is a tax increase.
Thank you, Barry.
Okay. Public members, go ahead, please. Who wants to start?
I could start if you'd like.
Go right ahead.
first point about inflation.
Is that Marty?
Yes, it is. Marty Melkonian.
Marty Milconin. Thank you, sir.
Mute? No, I'm okay. Okay. It's not agreed as to how inflation will affect us in the future. What we know is that it's rising at perhaps 3% for the entire year, according to the Fed chairman. The 5% that was quoted relates to a particular month when, in fact, the base was very low. In other words, they're comparing, say, June of 2020 with June 2021. In 2020, a lot of prices were down. For example, airline fares, hotels, restaurant costs, those were down. Now they've come back. And so that shows, at least for this month, an extraordinary sharp rise in inflation. But the overall rate is supposed to be in the order of 3%. Okay, we don't know.
Can I make I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt. I'm on my phone, but I'm sorry, Martin. Are you finished? When you are, I just want to respond. That's okay.
Sure.
I apologize.
That's okay. The point I want to make about inflation is that not only does it affect landlords' costs, but tenants suffer from inflation as well. So inflation cuts both ways. It's not necessarily only on building owners. Did you want to respond to that point before I go on to some of the other issues?
No, I think it's fine. I'm Pat. I'm okay.
I thought I read that it was the last 12 months was 5%.
No.
I thought I read that.
No, it's not been 5%.
I'll have to look at that. I'll look that up.
In terms of the question of dealing with cash flow, that is an important issue. And if there is insufficient cash flow, that will have negative effects in terms of owners being able to maintain their property. But it should be pointed out, and I think I've done this before, asset values have risen for housing on Long Island and also for those houses that are under our jurisdiction. In other words, ETPA homes, they've risen in price. Okay.
I do want to respond to that when it's
If
finished.
the asset is rising, that permits owners that are facing difficult cash flows to borrow. And as Catherine pointed out, 25 landlords apparently refinanced last year at historically the lowest interest rates in recent history. Okay, that means that there's an advantage to refinancing, and I suspect that some of that refinancing had to do with paying current bills, but also it might have been for other investments. And I guess—
Can I respond? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm on the phone. Just let me know when I can speak, okay, so I don't interrupt.
To that point, because I have a third one to make, but let's hear what you have to say to this one.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, when we are talking refinancing and values going up, because of the restrictions that the regulations have put on landlords, cap rates in essence rose. When cap rates rise, values drop. Second, not everyone could easily finance their apartment building, even though lenders prefer apartment buildings. First, because of the delinquencies with maybe potential tenants. Second, because of certain COVID restrictions that all banks have put. COVID restrictions mean that most lenders, almost all lenders that I know of, require 6 months to 1 year debt service to be put up in escrow to make sure we're paying their bills. There are a number of landlords that chose not to refinance for the reasons that I mentioned, irrespective of the rates. Rates have been low, there's no question. But values the past year on apartment houses have not risen. They've in essence either stayed the same or they dropped. And that's a fact. That comes from Richard DiGeronimo, MAI. It comes from Goodman Marks, MAIs. And it comes from lenders. And I can name any number of lenders, factual. But I just wanted to make a point. And one other point, because we've been talking about this a long time. Asset net should have no bearing on determining one's paying the bills. It has absolutely nothing to do with the cash flow and the ability to pay. And Martin, I always say this, and it's a good example. If I call Hofstra, and Hofstra says, and I say, listen, Martin Malkovian's house went up in value, don't give him a raise. That's exactly what this is referring to. And now I'll listen to what you have to say. I just want to make it a very specific factual point. That's all.
Barrett, listen, if your asset is rising in price, you are wealthier. And as a result, even though your income may be diminished, which is not the case in the case of this past year, you're still better off. You're still better off. And the fact that you can refinance at extraordinarily low rates is a tremendous advantage. So there are some landlords who may not be
at times, Martin, at times that's correct. Of course, if you take Catherine's standpoint the other day when she said refinance and that you can take some money out, and a lot of borrowers were not taking money out because of what I described, that you could buy another property. The bottom line is it's still debt. Still got to pay it back, whether the rate's low or not.
Yeah,
and in order to pay it back, you have to have tenants pay the rent. And the landlords have been having difficulty with that.
Okay. Professor, could I just read something to you? Maybe you could explain it to me, because it's economics. Okay? This is the annual inflation rate for the United States is 5% for the 12 months ended May 21, after rising 4.2% previously, according to U.S. Labor Department data published on June 10th. So how does that marry up to the 3% you were discussing?
The 3% relates to the projections of the Federal Reserve System. They're saying that previously we were running at about 2% inflation, or even slightly below that. In recent months, because of mostly supply bottlenecks, prices have gone up, and particularly when you relate it to a year ago, when in fact prices were depressed in several industries, that shows an extraordinarily high temporary inflation rate. But the projections are from perhaps our best most capable economic sources are that they're talking about a 3% rate. But regardless of the rate, both landlords and tenants are affected by inflation. It's not just the landlords.
Yeah, but the landlords aren't the government.
Yeah, Martin, also just a little bit, I have the chart in front of me, so I'm looking at it. I wish I could, show it. Actually, I probably could show it. There were a lot of depressed months in the CPI over the past 12 months. For example, September was 0.2% of last year, October 0.1, November 0.2, December 0.2, and then it was January of this year that it kind of started to kind of really jump up. I don't know if you could see the chart here, if you can see that. So that's the last 12 months, which is a 5% annual inflation rate. I believe the Fed chair is talking about anticipating this to be somewhat transitory in the future, and then also maybe over the next number of years being about 3%. So I think that's where the inflation in the short term, which it was 0.8% in April, 0.6% last month, 0.6% in March. It'll be interesting, what June's is, but I think prices and, when it's hard to find workers, for these types of businesses are probably going to keep their prices up a little bit. That probably, again, I'm not an economist, you know a lot more about it than I do, but I think that, inflation is going to be 5 for the near future, maybe drops to 3 on an estimate, maybe next year or whatnot.
I'm not that smart.
Well, I think no one.
I sat next to Martin a lot, and he taught me a lot about economics. So that's where I got my knowledge from.
No one knows exactly the rate of inflation, but I think we have to go with the people who are most knowledgeable about it and who have studied it. And well, they're the ones that are making the projections of the 3% rate this year. And probably.
But the reality is, has anyone gone to fill up their tank and their gas? A little bit of increase, right?
I noticed when I went to buy some plywood recently, the price came down. What does that prove? Don't talk to me about a single commodity. Look at the whole index.
Well, the whole index of not only labor, but of building materials have gone up, and it keeps on going up. And that's according to a number of the builders. So
there are many areas, particularly in lumber, that's actually come down very sharply.
Yeah, it actually has come down.
The market works. The market works.
now you're talking about a free market, but we don't have a free market under rent stabilization. So I just want to make that point.
We don't have a free market under the free market according to the Chicago School, which came up with the free market principles and abandoned them.
I guess one of the things that I think was not fully addressed was the net operating income that was received this year, 36.2%, which happens to be the highest net operating income in this entire century. Okay, that's the highest. So to say that building owners are suffering, that may be true in individual cases, but on average, their net operating income has been showing an upward trend and actually peaked last year. It peaked mostly because though we had flat rental incomes, we had a decline, a small decline in expenses. The net result of that was higher net operating income. So when that exists, when we see net operating incomes, it's pretty hard to justify further increases in rental.
Martin, if we could just convert that to dollars, which I attempted to do in my comments, it's $30,000 before interest. Person has, maybe that's all they have is one building. On average, it's $85,000 in rent, $55,000 in expenses, $30,000 net. You know, I don't see that as a big windfall. I just don't see it. The average on 98 buildings is $85,000 in rent.
Whatever the dollar.
We're not talking about $1 million rents where they make $360,000. That was what my point was.
Yeah. Well, whatever the dollar amount is, we have historically judged the return to the landlord by net operating income. And if that trend is upward, we want to make a case for any rise in rents at this point.
I agree if the rent was $1 million, he makes $360. If it's $85,000, they make $30,000.
Yeah, but it's still big.
Can I make a point, Michael?
Absolutely. Go ahead, Andy.
Sure. So, Martin, I did a lot of, kind of analyzing the numbers over the past years and, agree with the facts that you're stating in terms of the net operating income, has been rising in the last, and I kind of looked at the last 10 years and then obviously the last 3 or 4, which would more apply to today. I have in front of me, I have the cost to income ratio. So my numbers that I'll read off here are kind of the inverse of that. So the lower this number would be the better. So in 2011, about 10 years ago, the cost to income ratio was 71%. So that was pretty much a low for a long time. And I think as a public member, part of what I see our role is to try to come up with what is a reasonable rent increase for a tenant as low as possible, and also allow that to not impact so negatively the profit margin for landlords. So the more money the landlords make and the less the tenants pay, whatever that kind of it's almost like Goldilocks. You got to get it in there somewhere, and that's what I try to analyze. So over the past, let's say, 10 years, and I'll run these numbers quick, but it's more for the trend. 2012 was the cost ratio was 67, 66, 67, 65, 64, and then it started kind of coming down, which is a positive for the landlords. In 17, it was 66, then 65, then 64, 63. So at the same time, though, the increases for the guidelines going back to, let's say, 2012, let's say, I'll just read the 1 year just to be quick. All of the 1 year increases were in the ones or below. So there was no 2% increases for a 1 year lease over the past 10 years. So that's pretty reasonable, I would say, in the tenant's favor. 12, 13 was 1.75, and I'll just read so on. 1%, 1%, 1.25, 0.5, and then as we get to the last 4 years, 17, 18 was 0, actually. 18, 19 was 1, 2. 19, 20 was 1.5, 2.5, and then last year was 0, 0. So I look at both charts, and I kind of look that both sides were probably benefiting equally to some degree. Obviously, each side will disagree with me, but I'm in the middle. My opinion this year, and we're looking to forecast forward, is I think inflation, it will have an impact. I think that my recommendation or my opinion would be not to be 0, 0. I think we should get off of that. I think we should have at least a 1 on the 1 year. And I agree with the testimony of Mr. Rush every year that the second year lease should be commensurate with the 1 year. It shouldn't be the same. There should be enough margin so that it's fair to landlords who take on the 2 year leases, so that they don't get no increase that second year. So I would say, at least a 1 to 2 would be, I think, the minimum that we should look at this year. And part of it is our, forecasting for the next 12 months. We're not going to know what if we're right or we're wrong until the net operating income and these income and expense reports come out next year. And my opinion on that is we can criticize any aspect of the data, but we have, I think, had most of the same people putting these numbers together for many, many years. So if it's the same people putting the numbers together, they're probably making similar decisions along the way. So I think these numbers are probably pretty consistent, whether you agree with them or not agree with them. I think that if they decide to add something or decide to take something out as an outlier, the same people are probably making, decision making, the same way over the years. So that's just my opinion. I don't know if anyone has any questions on that.
Yeah, I got a question.
Sure.
Adam, didn't you do like a study like a few years ago about 1 versus 2 year leases that showed that there was not a big disparity or loss, quite the opposite in the 2 year lease?
I just did the calculation of what percent, if you had a 1 year, I wish I had it in front of me. I don't have it in front of me. But if you had let's say a 1 year lease for 1%, what would this, if you had to then increase that lease again at the end of the 1 year for the second year at 1%, what would you have to make the second year be to make it equivalent? And it was about, I think it was like 1.75% or something like that. And I made a little chart for 1%, 2%, 3% on 1 year leases, and then what the second year lease would have to be just to make it equivalent. So that was just a calculation. That was just a chart. It wasn't even an analysis. It was just a formula.
Adam, could I comment on your comment, which was that there have been very moderate increases, and last year there's no increase in the red guidelines. And yet profits have gone up, or net operating income has gone up. What does that tell us?
Well, I think that the board in the last 10 years has been very fair to both sides, I think, because the rents have been reasonable and the
higher return with no increase, doesn't that say that why should we want to raise?
Well, we're forecasting the next year. So I was surprised when I got the numbers, and that's why I spent a lot of time looking into it. And I think that whether it was turnover of buildings and that increased the rent, whether it was more tenants paid, that's why I asked the question to Andy about the basis of the numbers. If they're in theory, if they're accrual numbers where every month the tenant's supposed to pay $1,000 and then that gets recorded, and then at the end of the 12-month period, it shows $1,000. Did the tenant actually pay the $1,000? So if the tenant only paid 9 months of that, then that shouldn't be $12,000 over the year. It would have been $9,000 over the year, or whatever the numbers would be. So I was curious from the accounting perspective whether it was kind of accrual based, which is linear over time, or whether it was cash basis, meaning what did the landlords collect, and then did the landlords, maybe they show a high net operating income on the report, but then maybe they have a high accounts receivable, in which case they can't collect all that money. So I was just curious about that. I'm basing my analysis on it's basically accrual basis that they build all of this out, and it's their responsibility for collections, obviously. But I also see a lot of we talked a little bit about the different stimulus, and then the New York State and the federal government additions to helping tenants in terms of rental repayments and their different ideas that they're not even ideas but policies that they're putting in place, and also some of the different stimulus. We talked a little bit about it. Andy and Catherine were talking about that in terms of how much money did people receive. How was it received? Was it based on income? Was it based on their 2019 tax returns, things like that. And then also unemployment. So if there were, unfortunately, if people, were unemployed over the last, year and change, there were federal additions to the New York State unemployment system. I think anywhere from $300 to $600, depending on, what people were making and whatnot. So I think that from someone in the middle, someone trying to come to a compromise and find a fair solution, I think that there was a lot of money that was put behind helping people to pay their rents, and that continues, and even future programs are in place. I think that the landlords will have higher inflation moving forward. It's right around 5% today. So let's just be reasonable in the next 6 months. Maybe it stays around the same, and then maybe it tears down. So I think in this year, I think that we go, north of 0.0, and we can come, obviously everyone will have their opinion on that. And we will see from our decision that we make tonight, we won't really know until these income and expense reports come out next year, if we're correct. I think that, just from the last 4 years, and I'm looking, this is more on the landlord side, 17-18 was 0.0, 18-19 was 1.2, 19-20 was 1.5, 2.5. Maybe that's more about what I maybe would recommend this year. And then last year, 0.0. So those last 4 years have been, and even 16-17 was 0.5% and 1%. So I understand the arguments on both sides. There's bad landlords out there that are taking advantage of people, and we nobody here condones that. We're all against that. And then obviously on the tenant side, I understand some people may still be having a tough time. I absolutely understand that. But I think there's more help, and Mr. McKee would know all the specifics, and I read all of his information too. There's a lot of help for tenants right now, so I think that we can come to a good compromise. Not that I don't compare us to exactly to Rockland or New York City or even Westchester, but as I think Andy mentioned before, the decision that New York City made, I don't know how they made that first part of the decision. I don't know how they get that in there, but I guess they were going to kind of leave the first 6 months at 0%. But let's back that out of our decision. They're kind of coming up with a 1.5, 2.5 for New York City. And then Rockland came up with a half by 0.75. That's what their decision was. I watched some of their deliberations, or most of the deliberation. So I think, again, my opinion is off of 0.0, and then just have enough for the second year lease, so that it's commensurate for a landlord.
I'm going to interject for a second. I just want to make one point. When somebody's on unemployment, if you've been, even if you receive the $300 or $600 more, considering how much it costs to live in New York, for instance, if I went on unemployment and I even got the extra $600, a week, I would still be running at a deficit to what my regular salary was. So just because the government decided to get off of $425 a week and give some people $300 for a period of time, some people $600 a period of time, that does not mean that was extra money that they were getting if they had lost their position. I just want to make that clear, because everybody keeps using this as if, oh, well, all these people all of a sudden got all this money. It's like, well,
I'm not saying that, Catherine. I'll be I'll be specific. As I said, if someone's on unemployment, that's terrible. Emotionally, it's very draining. You're trying to support your family. I absolutely understand that. I'm not saying that they're receiving extra money. I'm not saying that. What I said was that in addition to the New York State unemployment, the federal government contributed more to what it would normally be in normal years. And also from that person who is in that kind of situation, and I've never heard this before, or I don't recall it, and I'm not young, but I don't remember a time when there was a rent reimbursement program from the federal or the state or the local governments. As Mr. McKee said the other night, and I know Mr. Paddock is probably a really great landlord because he's trying to help his tenants out to get that rent reimbursement. So I'm not saying it's easy to get that either, but that is available. And I think we need to take that into consideration, that there's a lot of more support in the last 12 months. And obviously it's probably all mostly due to COVID, but there's more support for individuals, whether it's a stimulus from the federal government, it's unemployment from New York State and the federal government, whether it's nonprofit organizations helping individuals get rental reimbursement income from a state agency, whichever agency that is. Which I don't know. Has that even been a program in the past? I don't remember that.
And anybody who's been trying to navigate unemployment, and this is real from my business life to do with New York State Department of Labor, is a mess right now. And it's usually the people who are higher income, who have lost their jobs, that are having a heck of a time getting their money for unemployment from New York State. And I have at least 4 clients who were in the financial industry where they've been waiting for over 8 months without getting their reimbursement from that. The other point I wanted to make is the program that we're talking about to do with paying the back rent. And it's a good thing. And I think it's a good thing that it's happening. It benefits the tenant in terms of when they lift the non-eviction order, but the money goes directly to the landlord. So it's something really, if you look at it, benefits both. The landlord gets directly paid the back rent that's owed. And so the tenant doesn't touch it, but it prevents the tenant from being evicted. And I look at that as being a win-win.
I agree 100%, and I was happy to hear that Mr. Paddock is helping his tenants to do that. It would make sense that the incentive, if a landlord is owed back rent from a tenant, for them to be proactive and help their tenants. Or maybe there are, as I mentioned, nonprofit organizations that could, who may be more versed in the paperwork aspect of it, who he or she, the landlord, could introduce to their tenants to file those types of documents. And if they're filing those documents on behalf of, dozens or hundreds or thousands of people, they may have more success, and they may kind of really, not command, but become proficient in that system, and they could help
And
out.
there absolutely are not-for-profits that are doing that. That's not hard to find.
Sure.
Okay.
Adam, 2 comments. I do know 2 companies who do report on the accrual basis, so they would report the income. But out of these 98, there's no way to tell. And the other thing I wanted to mention is I've spoken to some of the landlords, and during COVID, there were a lot of projects that were deferred because you couldn't do them. So that's why repairs didn't look like it was down. And I would expect it to boost up now that hopefully COVID's near being done. We'll see about that, but
that makes sense.
Yeah.
Adam?
Sure.
You had mentioned about the ERAP and that we should take that into account. I think the fact that the legislature saw fit to pass the ERAP because there were tenants having trouble paying their rents argues that we shouldn't see any increase in rents. And Barry mentioned that landlords were having problems with tenants paying the rent and everything. Raising the rents certainly will not help in that regard.
I think, and I don't know if I don't mean this in a negative way, but I kind of want both sides to not like the decision, right? So one side should not, if one side doesn't love every part of it and the other side doesn't want any part of it, doesn't like every part of it, it's probably a fair, because I'm in the middle. So I'm not, if everyone doesn't like me at the end of the call, except for the public members, I can live with that.
Let me hear from some of the other board members before I move on. I see, Barry, you have you're back live with us. Let me hear from Janetta. Some of the folks I've just not heard from tonight. Go ahead.
Good evening. So I agree completely with Adam, and I think we're in catastrophic times. However, both sides have to suffer through this. I don't think we can do 0-0 again. I mean, we can argue both sides that the tenant receives monies, but these are the same arguments we told the landlords about they're eligible for pilot incentives. So, we can't say it's good for a tenant, but they're not good for a landlord or vice versa. It has to be a reasonable increase. It has to be where both sides are going to sustain a little bit of hurt. These are the times we're in. And for the entire system to work over the long term, we can't have 0-0 again. It has to be a balancing act. And I think this year, if any, is a perfect time where we have to do it, because again, now you have tenants, no matter how minor they are receiving or have the ability to receive monies, no matter how complicated it may be, it's still an option for them the same way it is for a landlord to get tax incentives.
Can I make a statement? That this is the true definition. And, I may agree or disagree with what Janetta just said and Adam said. This is the true definition of what a public member, how they should do it, not to make either side happy. That's a perfect definition. And I wish other people would follow that model. Thank you.
One more point that came to mind. I read that Social Security could be going up 5% this year. So, that's something also.
Social Security goes up every year.
Yeah, 1%. Last year, I think went up.
No, it went up much more than 1% last year.
What?
I think it went up more than 1% last year.
It wasn't 2, I know that. But 5% is a big jump.
Yeah.
And that's an if, correct?
5% would cover the cost of living, right? If 5% is inflation, as you're suggesting.
Well, according to you, should go up 3%.
No, not according to me, according to Jerome Powell.
What does he know?
Garrett, while you're up, let me hear your comments. Go ahead.
Martin knows just as much as Chairman Powell does.
I do agree that, we can't do 0-0 again. We did that last year, and last year was almost a no-brainer, given the state of the world and the state of the tenants in Nassau County. I think now that we've pretty much come out of this, I agree with you, that it's got to be a balancing act. And you've got to go back to practical considerations and, not shun landlords as being ogres. Look, they're businessmen trying to make a buck just like everybody else, and tenants are trying to pay it. So it's a balancing act. But again, it's got to be more than 0-0. And I say, let's vote.
Okay.
Could I make a comment here?
Go ahead.
If last year was 0-0, and now net operating income is at a peak, why can't we go again with a 0-0? It doesn't make sense. If they're able to find other ways, cutting costs or finding other sources of rental income, and still reach a peak in net operating income, why should we raise the guidelines?
I think there were many factors that occurred in the last 12 months. All of the federal government stimulus, the inflation in the short term hitting 5%, but that 5%, if you remember the chart, it was 0.6% last month, 0.8% the month before, and 0.6% the month before that. So the majority of that is actually like we're experiencing it right now. So I think that spike in inflation is going to be at the tail end of this year, which ends September 30th, I think. And then as it goes through the beginning of the next fiscal year that the leases will start, I think the expenses are going to be higher, moving forward. And I think that, but also taking into consideration the ability to pay the rents, there's much more money being, invested or provided by the different government programs. So I think there's many factors to justify on both sides. The expenses will be higher for landlords, but the rents will be easier is not the right word, I don't think, but there's more support to pay rent. And if people had owed back rents, there are programs that are out there that, again, I don't recall those types of programs paying, Mr. McKee said possibly 15 months of rents in certain circumstances, not every circumstance, but in certain circumstances. So putting those both together, my forecast, and again, it's my opinion, is that I think that in the last few years, the net operating income was rising. So I think that was a good thing. And the tenant guidelines were not egregious or extremely high. And I think in the next 12 months, we won't know. But again, Garrett agreed, I think Jeanette agreed, going off of 0-0, I think is kind of my conclusion to a degree. How high off of that, we all have to agree on. So I'm just thinking it's not 0-0. And let's give an example. If we put 1.5, 2.5 this year or something in that ballpark, and the net operating income next year is 42%, then we have this on video. We can look back to it and we made probably not a great decision. But if it's in the same realm of what it's been, then maybe that was a reasonable decision. Obviously it's a difficult decision.
Difficult, Adam. The trend is upward. What I'm saying is this is the peak net operating income with a 0-0 rent guideline.
But we're in
years now.
Well, let me ask you one question.
Net operating income, and here you're asking to raise
what was the last pandemic that we were able to study, and what were the impacts of all that stimulus into a government? And then there's even more stimulus now, and then there's even, again, this is more of an economics, macroeconomics question, but do we see inflation come down? People are saying it's transitory, and that may be true, but we're not going to know for another year or two if that's the case.
But why are we erring on the side of projections that are not what I would say most economists would agree to? Most economists are saying,
My biggest
go
factor,
1%.
my biggest factor on that, I think, would be the government stimulus and investments and policies or programs to provide support for people who needed it, whether it was unemployment or just direct stimulus. And then specifically in Nassau County and in New York, and that's what I'm really looking at, are the and I don't know the acronym for it, but the different programs that are reimbursing tenants to be able to pay rent for them. And that's the main factor, which brought me above 0.0. You know, that's the main factor is the stimulus and the support programs that are helping people in need. And I think that's great. But I don't think that one side should benefit to a degree. And I'm not talking individuals. It's a general statement where the other side, they have needs as well, you know, and with higher inflation, higher expenses moving forward, Andy made a good point. There probably were restrictions on even doing some types of projects and maybe basic maintenance on certain properties that they may have been holding off on that, you know, so that may have saved them a little bit short term, but now that things are opening up, they can probably do some of those projects. Again, generalization, I don't have any specific examples of it. But my overall conclusion is that we go north of 0.0.
Adam, if net operating income next year goes down, I would agree with what you're saying. But if we're at the peak of net operating income, why should we now go ahead and raise the rent guidelines?
Are you talking as a tenant rep or a landlord rep?
It doesn't make sense.
Well, but we're forecasting. I think we're forecasting for the future, not necessarily. You know, we're almost a leading indicator to a degree rather than a lagging indicator. The lagging indicator are the net operating expenses, and our decision for the guidelines is kind of a leading indicator. You know, moving forward, anticipating or forecasting the next period.
All right, so let's transition into making some decisions tonight. Let me start. Do tenants or the landlords want to start? Andy?
Tenants could start.
Pardon me?
Tenants could start.
I'll start. I think I was somewhat surprised to hear about that. People saying, well, Social Security got a 3% increase, and we think there's going to be 5% inflation rate, so we should raise the rent on the seniors. Also, I think the emergency rental assistance program is because there's an emergency that tenants are having trouble paying their rents. And the net operating income shows the landlords are doing quite fine. So I know it's probably not going to pass, but I'm proposing a 0% for a 1-year lease and a 0% for a 2-year lease.
Does the motion have a second?
I'll second that, Catherine.
Catherine? All right, let's go down the line. Janetta? Are you for or against?
I'm sorry, no.
I'm just doing it in order. I have it here. Andy?
No.
Garrett?
No.
Adam?
No.
Martin?
Yes.
Robert? Well, Robert proposed it, so the motion does not carry. Barry, I'm sorry. Barry, I left out Barry.
Obviously, no.
All right, so the motion dies. I mean, it's voted down. Okay. So 0.0 is out, and I think that was the trend I was seeing anyway. Landlords, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'll
Go ahead, Andy.
I'll propose 2% for a 1-year and 3% for a 2-year.
Do you have a second?
I second it.
All right, let's go again. Janetta?
Sorry, I didn't hear the number. Can you say it again? I'm sorry.
2% for 1 year, 3% for 2 years.
No.
Garrett,
No.
Catherine,
No.
Adam,
No.
Martin,
The house phone upstairs.
Martin.
No.
Okay, dies.
And I'll try.
Okay, Garrett, go ahead.
I'll
Give me a
go
minute.
1%.
Let me just clean up my notes here, please.
Yeah.
Give me 1 second. Okay, go ahead, please.
This is what I was going to propose going in. So 1% for 1 year, 2% for 2 years.
Okay, do you have a second? Janetta, I see your hand, but for the record, please, I need your voice.
She's
Janetta,
muted.
You're muted,
We're,
Janetta.
we're unmuting you, Janetta.
You're muted.
You gotta unmute, Janetta. You can't.
I second it.
Okay. All right, let's go down the list. Andy,
I'm thinking. I just need a minute.
okay.
I think it's gonna carry. I'll say yes.
Okay. Catherine,
No.
Adam,
I'll say yes also.
Martin,
No.
Robert,
no.
Barry,
Yes. Yes, I don't know if anyone's heard me, but yes.
yes. Okay, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4. I say yes.
Carries.
Okay, so it carries.
My streak continues.
Okay, so it's 0.5% and 1%. 0.5% for 1 year leases and 2%. 0.5% for
I was
1 year.
1%. 1%.
0.5% and 1%.
No,
One.
1% and
1%
2%.
and 2%.
1% for 1 year, 2% for 2 years.
Right.
You change your vote, Mike, based on,
No, I didn't.
Yeah, if James can interject. So Garrett made the motion 1%, 2%. Janetta with a second. Andy, yes. Kathy, no. Adam, yes. Martin, no. Robert, no. Barry, yes. We could stop right there. That's 5 to 3. Michael, you made it 6 to 3. And you can do that. So the motion passes 1% 1 year, 2% 2 year.
Any other matters? Oh. All right, based on our deliberation tonight and over the last few weeks, we've listened to statements from landlords as well as tenants. We've gone over numbers from DHCR, CPI index, made fair comparisons. The decision is that for 1 year lease, it will be 1%, and for 2 year, the second year will be 2%. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Do you have a motion?
Good night, everyone. Have a good summer.
Right.
Motion to adjourn.
Have a good summer.
Motion to adjourn. Bye.
Motion for adjournment.
Motion.
Second.
Garrett, second by Barry. All in favor? Yes.
Aye.
Aye. Thank you very much. Thanks, DHCR. Have a very good holiday.
Good
Thank
night.
you.
Thanks all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.